Hi, I'm doing this video today to address an issue that was brought to me recently by one of our members. A friend of theirs had given them a copy of the newsletter from a local mainline church, a denomination that's a part of what's called the mainline Protestant churches. And in that particular newsletter, it was for this month, the March of 2020, the pastor said he was giving up Lent for Lent. Kind of I guess an ironical way of saying that he actually says it plainly, that he was giving up the things Lent points to, the themes of Lent. Our human sinfulness, he point blank says that he doesn't want to focus on human sinfulness, he doesn't want to focus and he doesn't believe in the doctrine of original sin, that there's this deep flaw in human nature. He wants to put aside the idea of a substitutionary kind of death of Jesus, the wrath of God, bloody religion. In fact, he goes on to say in this particular article that this is why the church is not growing, that this kind of faith and these teachings don't connect with people in our time and have lost their meaning. And it reminded me of a book that came out several years ago, many years ago, by a bishop in the Episcopal Church who was saying basically the same thing. And he wrote a book, Why Christianity Must Change or Die. Both these men are sensing something, that their churches, their denominations are shrinking, and they indeed are shrinking at a very alarming rate. But I think their diagnosis as to the reason why they're dying is really wrong. I don't think it's because of the beliefs that they've talked about, the beliefs generally of mainstream Christianity, or at least the predominant Christian views. But instead, they're under the grip of another belief system that I think is the source of their decline. And that belief system is what I would call mainlineism, and even mainstreamism. But mainline is the term that you hear a lot here. Sometime in the 20th century, the churches of the richer suburbs of Philadelphia that were serviced by the main line of the railroads were known as the Philadelphia Main Line. And of course these churches, the established churches, were in these wealthy areas. And to be from the right side of the track, so to speak, and to be a part of the mainstream of American culture and American life was to be a member of one of these particular denominations. And so they derive their name Mainline from this. At least that's what several sources say. And the very idea that's expressed in Mainline, whether or not that's exactly how it historically came about, the idea is that they are the mainstream. And I would say that idea is they are the mainstream in the sense of being the closest thing to an established church. In the 50s, the President of the United States at that time, Dwight Eisenhower, dedicated the headquarters for these denominations that was located in New York City. And that bringing together of American culture and of these churches, and there being set in this particular role of being at the heart of American life, was really solidified there in the 50s. In fact, if you read books by Protestant theologians prior to the 50s, they were concerned about the decline of church attendance and the decline of faith. But after the Depression and after World War II, people went back to the churches. They wanted to establish a kind of normality that they had not experienced in these great upheavals and traumas of the 20th century. And so this desire to establish a sense of order and unity and harmony, and that included church involvement, and that whole generation. I had the privilege of knowing so many of them as a pastor, pastoring a church that has a history in the main line. So many of these members were wonderful people and are often called, and I think rightly so, the greatest generation. And they were joiners. They belonged to not just the local churches, but to many of the local volunteer organizations and to card groups where they would play cards, and they would be a part of groups that would go dancing together. They were joiners. It was before the great isolation that has taken place in our time with gated communities and life lived on the internet. And this led to a great growth in the churches. The church I pastor had experienced a tremendous growth in the 1950s. But it also established and solidified a particular mindset among these churches that they were a part of the mainstream of American life, and they could depend upon people coming to church because that's what people do in this country. And being a part of the mainstream, people are going to come to you, and you're going to be a part of the community and received and welcomed. And not long after the 50s, of course, you have the 1960s and the great throwing off of a lot of the things that the parents had sought. Francis Schaeffer spoke of the 50s as a time of seeking personal peace and prosperity. And I think many things, his critiques of that time are right. He's wrong, I think, when he doesn't bring up the fact that there were these great community efforts and the reaching out through civic engagement, the positive things of the 50s. But it still left a spiritual emptiness in many of the children where they rebel in the 60s, and you have a movement away from a lot of the things that their parents had done. And indeed, religion was transformed in its understanding. People began not to see that you had to go to church, just to go to church. They didn't want the children, many of them, mere externalism, worrying about what the neighbors would think or what people at work would think. They were seeking a kind of authenticity that you see in things like the hippie movement and all the different things that were going on at the time. It was a search for something genuine and real, in a sense that some of this that they had been experiencing was a phoniness and a keeping up of appearances. And in the life of the church, you do have the Jesus movement, the birth of contemporary worship, various ways in which people were seeking to make faith their own. But for many who had been a part of this mainline stream, that whole culture of we are the established church, and this institution is what is the key here, and our being a part of the institution, led to a mindset that was really strangely now at odds with the mainstream of American life. And really, throughout its history, America has been different in that it has had these new religions that get born, new denominations that get born, and church attendance overall in the history of this country has been much more about personal conviction. But so much of the mainline today looks back strangely and ironically because they often see themselves as liberal and progressive in the sense of throwing off things that, like this pastor, throwing off these old beliefs. And yet if you would attend that church, you would find it to be a very traditional church in the way that it looks and most of the elements of the worship. And there's a holding on to a particular time in history, which I would say is the 1950s, which is, I guess, ironic because they would see that as, in their theology, as a very backward time in some ways. And yet that institutionalism and that being a church with the idea that we're the church and no matter what we teach and however we are, people are going to come to us, that just doesn't fly. Throughout that same period, when you have mainlineism going on, you have this movement known as evangelicalism. And why evangelicalism flourishes today is because it never saw itself as an established church. They always saw themselves as outsiders. And they didn't look at everyone around them as being Christian, and this being and this is, I think, a paradox, because on the one hand, evangelicals will talk about the country's Christian history, and that there's a lot of elements to our country that are formed from Christian faith. But they have this theology that teaches simply because you're in a church doesn't make you a Christian, and simply because you say certain things doesn't make you a Christian. Their deep belief in personal conversion has led them always to be seeking to bring people to faith. And that has kept them on the outside in many ways and separate from the mainstream of American culture, which has made them ideally suited for a time like this, in which the churches find themselves no longer in the mainstream. And there's not as much desire on the part of evangelicals to adapt to the mainstream and to fit in, as you find among the churches under the grips of mainlineism, and that desire to be the institution that it once was in the 50s. And many have noticed this. A particular theologian from that mainline tradition, Douglas John Hall, years ago began to talk about the new context in which we live. And more people have talked, both among the mainline and the evangelical, for the need to have a missionary mindset, a missional mindset in North America. But evangelicals have always had that, because they've always been seeking to bring people to a genuine, saving faith versus a nominal faith. And they saw so much of the mainline as really fostering a kind of nominalism because of its easy connection to the mainstream of American society. And so why the mainline must change or die is what I would say, is because that situation has been deteriorating, that golden age of the 50s began to decline right in the 60s, and from then on, from the 60s onward, all those denominations declined, even as others grew, and have far outstripped those denominations in that time period, in the non-denominational churches. And precisely those churches that are preaching the old theology, but in a way that speaks to the person in the sense of seeking authenticity. And you can see no matter how you feel about contemporary Christian worship and music, the point behind them is authenticity, of seeking an authentic, genuine appropriation of the classic Christian teachings. And what you find over and over again is, as people authentically receive these things into their lives, it's a living, dynamic thing. And that, in my mind, is as plain as the nose on my face, that the source for growth and development in the church is going to be in those churches that are able to make the faith their own in a living and dynamic way, and are not dependent upon being the established religion.